Behind the glimmering jumpsuits, the thunderous applause, and the ever-watchful cameras, lies a story rarely told. One that reveals the man beneath the crown, the weight he carried, and the secrets that shaped his life. It's a story of triumph and tragedy, of light and shadow entwined in the life of a king who was as human as any of us. And as we journey through this hidden history, you might find pieces that resonate, fragments of your own struggles, your own dreams, or your own hidden battles. Before we begin, if you feel drawn to these stories, to this quiet exploration beneath the surface, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Supporting this channel helps keep these voices alive and brings more stories like this into the quiet corners of the internet. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening right now? What hour does your clock mark as you drift into this story? There's a unique comfort in sharing these moments, a connection born from strangers gathering under the same night sky, united by curiosity and a thirst for truth. Maybe this story will accompany your thoughts as you rest, or perhaps it will stir a new understanding when morning comes. So, wherever you are, and whatever time it is, let's begin. Let me take you back. Not to Graceland. Not to the glitter or the hips or the headlines. But to the silence that came before all that. To a world unknowingly waiting for someone like Elvis Presley. Not because they knew his name, but because they knew the ache he would one day speak to. The 1940s had ended in smoke and ash. World War II had left the world exhausted, hollowed out, and searching. And though the 1950s are often painted in pastel colors and jukebox smiles, the truth is, America was anxious. The war was over, yes. The men had come home. The factories were booming. But beneath the polished surface was something else, a sense that something was missing. Young people, especially teenagers, were beginning to feel it most. You see, before the 1950s, there wasn't really such a thing as a teenager. Not culturally. You were either a child or an adult. You worked or you studied. You were seen or you were ignored. But now, this new class of humans was emerging. Not yet grown, but no longer innocent. And they didn't want jazz. They didn't want swing or Sinatra or the carefully combed optimism of their parents' music. They wanted something raw. Something that sounded like how they felt inside. Restless, confused, angry, electric. The nation had no name for it yet. But it was there. In the growing beat of black rhythm and blues, played in smoky clubs in Memphis and Chicago. In the rural twang of country and western, born in the Appalachian hollows. In gospel choirs that lifted spirits while hiding pain. In bars and basements, black and white sounds were rubbing shoulders, uninvited, sometimes illegal, often forbidden, but unstoppable. Meanwhile, television was becoming a fixture in American homes. For the first time in history, culture could spread visually and instantly. And yet, what people saw on screen was still tame. Safe. Sanitized. Everyone looked like they belonged to a catalog. The music was polite. The smiles were permanent. The danger had been trimmed out. But in the shadows of all that order, behind the nylon stockings and fedoras and two-button suits, a quiet pressure was building. A longing. Not just for rebellion, but for something authentic. Someone who wasn't polished. Who didn't look like a product. Who sounded like heat and grit and hunger. Someone who could stand at the crossroads between cultures, white and black, country and blues, sinner and saint, and not choose a side, but embody both. And then, a truck driver's son from Tupelo picked up a guitar. Not to change the world. Not to become the king. Just to sing. But his voice. It carried all of it. The ache. The confusion. The wild, unspoken longing of a generation too young to explain what they wanted, and too old to settle for what they'd been given. It was as if the air had already made room for him. As if, in every sock hop and schoolyard and segregated street corner, there was a gap in the shape of Elvis Presley, waiting to be filled. Because when he stepped to that mic, when he curled his lip, when he let out that first trembling growl, it didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like a release. As though the whole country had been holding its breath, and finally, someone had given it permission to exhale. But that moment was still just ahead. For now, in this early chapter, all we had were the whispers, the stirrings, the low hum of revolution without a name, a guitar in the back of a pickup truck, a radio signal crossing state lines, a hip twitch in a mirror no one was supposed to see, the calm before the storm. And oh, what a storm it would be. Before the Cadillac, before the gold lame suits, the screaming crowds, and the global iconography. There was a small house in Tupelo, Mississippi, barely 300 square feet, with no electricity, no plumbing, and a boy who would one day be king, born in the humblest of circumstances imaginable. January 8, 1935. Elvis Aaron Presley entered the world as a twin. But his brother, Jesse Garin, was stillborn. And from the very beginning, Elvis lived with a kind of silent companion, the shadow of someone who should have been beside him. Some say he carried that weight all his life. That he was born with both light and grief in his bones. His parents, Gladys and Vernon Presley, were poor even by Depression-era standards. They moved from rental to rental, often struggling to put food on the table. But if there was anything Elvis lacked in material comfort, he made up for in one precious currency: love. Gladys was fiercely protective. To her, Elvis was not just a son, he was a miracle. He slept in the same bed as his parents well into childhood. She doted on him, disciplined him, worried over him, prayed over him. He called her Satneen Dot. She called him the only thing I ever loved. And in that tight, trembling bond between mother and son, something powerful was planted. A need for affection that would one day bloom across stages, but which, at its root, was deeply personal, fragile, needy, tender. Elvis grew up in a world of contradictions. The South in the 1930s and 40s was a place of severe racial segregation, but also of musical integration in a strange, underground way. White churches had choirs. Black churches had spirit. And Elvis, a white boy who often stood alone, quiet, awkward, poor, felt pulled to the latter. He'd sit outside black gospel tents, soaking in the rhythms, the shouts, the movement. He was drawn to the voice, long before he ever dreamed of fame. At home, he sang gospel with his parents. He carried around his guitar like a security blanket. Neighbors remember him as shy, almost painfully so, and deeply polite. In school, he didn't stand out much. Except for one thing, he always had music. Whether it was in the back of the class, or walking down the road, or sitting alone under a tree, Elvis hummed to himself. Softly. Constantly. As if music was the only place he belonged. But there's something else to understand about the boy from Tupelo. He was poor, but proud. Quiet, but intense. Soft-spoken, but fiercely emotional. He felt things big. And when he felt them, they showed, in his eyes, in his voice, in the way his foot tapped to a beat no one else heard. In 1948, when he was 13, the Presley family moved to Memphis. It wasn't glamorous, not yet. They lived in public housing and worked menial jobs. But Memphis was electric. It had Beale Street, with its black-owned clubs and blues joints. It had record shops and pawn shops and the whisper of opportunity. If you were brave enough to chase it. And Elvis was listening to gospel, to rhythm and blues, to country western, to crooners and shouters and screamers and guitar men playing in doorways for nickels. He didn't know it yet, but he was absorbing it all. The voice of the South, the ache of poverty, the soul of America's musical underbelly, stitched into one skinny white teenager with sad eyes and a second-hand guitar. And here's what strikes me, looking back. When you see Elvis in those early photos, slick back hair, oversized clothes, eyes too old for his age, you don't see a future superstar. You see a boy still carrying the echo of his twin brother. You see a boy trying to make his mama proud. You see a boy watching the world more than speaking to it. But listening so deeply, it was as if he could already hear the audience applause, faint, distant, but inevitable. This was the boy from Tupelo. Not a king. Not yet. Just a soft, strange, musical soul. Standing at the edge of a world that didn't quite know what to do with him, but would soon belong to him. The first time most people heard Elvis Presley, they made a very simple assumption. They thought he was black. Not because they saw him, they hadn't, but because of what they heard. There was a grit to it, a grind, a southern ache you didn't find in most white performers. It sounded like it had come from the other side of town, from back porches and Baptist churches, juke joints and field hollers, not from the clean, polished halls of white America. And when people realized that this voice, this sensual, trembling, gospel-slicked wail, belonged to a white boy with a trucker's haircut and a crooked smile, it did something to them. Some were thrilled. Some were enraged. And everyone paid attention. You see, America in the 1950s was a country of fences. There were white spaces and black spaces. White music and black music. White audiences and black audiences. And rarely did they mix without resistance. But Elvis broke the radio. His first real hit, "That's Alright," was a cover of a song by Arthur Big Boy Crudup, a black bluesman. Elvis didn't mimic it. He didn't parody it. He just sang it, the way he felt it, the way it lived in his bones. It didn't come out clean. It came out real. And people didn't know what to do with that. He moved like a black artist. He sang like a black artist. But he looked like the boy next door. And that, my friend, is where the story gets complicated. Because some people celebrated him as a bridge, a revelation, the new sound of youth. But others, especially in black communities, saw what was really happening. The sound wasn't new. Only the face was. Rhythm and blues had been around. Gospel had been around. Swing, boogie, the electric guitar, all had been building for decades in black America, out of joy, sorrow, resistance, and invention. But now that it came through a white mouth, it was suddenly safe. Now, it could be played in white diners, on mainstream radio, on national TV. Elvis was not the inventor of rock and roll. He was its amplifier. And to this day, some see that as theft. Others see it as tribute. The truth is somewhere in the middle, like it usually is. Because Elvis loved black music. He didn't hide it. He didn't deny it. He credited it in interviews, covered black artists, and famously said, "The only thing that colored people can do for me is to buy my records and shake my hand." But still, he benefited. He rose through a system that rewarded his whiteness while keeping the very artists he admired in the shadows. He was allowed to be dangerous, because his skin made it palatable. He was allowed to sing of lust, move his hips, shout and moan and sway, because it came in the package of a southern white boy with bedroom eyes. And that made him unstoppable. Radio DJs didn't know where to file him. Was he country? Blues? Gospel? Kids didn't care. They just turned the dial up. In the South, where segregation was still the law, white teenagers began sneaking off to buy race records, because Elvis had cracked the door open. They followed the trail back to Chuck Berry, to Little Richard, to Fats Domino. Elvis hadn't invented the music, but he had made it contagious. And that, in itself, was dangerous. Because rock and roll wasn't just a new genre, it was a rebellion. A threat to the quiet conformity of post-war America. It didn't wear a suit. It didn't sit still. It sweated. It moaned. It grooved. And when Elvis performed, especially live, it was never just a concert. It was a rupture. There was the voice, raw, hiccuping, drawn from somewhere primal. There were the hips, swiveling, twitching, inciting outrage and obsession in equal measure. And there were the eyes, half-lidded, lost in the music, unaware or uncaring of the chaos he was causing. Parents were horrified. Clergy condemned him. Newspapers called him a threat to public decency. But the kids? The kids screamed. Because they saw what the grown-ups couldn't. That this boy from Mississippi was theirs. He wasn't clean. He wasn't careful. He felt things out loud. He was confusing, sexy, vulnerable, rebellious, unsure, just like them. And here's what I think when I look back on those early days. Elvis didn't steal black music, but he stepped into a current that had been flowing long before him, and the current swept him forward like a river suddenly let loose. He wrote it. He loved it. He profited from it. And maybe, just maybe, he also got trapped by it. Because once the world heard that voice that didn't match his skin, they didn't want him to be anything else. Not a thinker. Not a critic. Not a man. Just the sound. Just the hips. Just the product. And in time, that would cost him dearly. But in this moment, he was still rising. Still electric. Still confusing the country, and thrilling it, with every breath he took on a microphone. He was the white boy who sang like the South. And whether you loved him or loathed him, you couldn't ignore him. Not anymore. Every star has a turning point. A moment when the raw talent meets the right, or sometimes the wrong, person, and everything changes. For Elvis Presley, that person was a man who didn't even have a real name. He called himself Colonel Tom Parker. But he wasn't a colonel. He wasn't born Tom. And he certainly wasn't from the American South. His real name was Andreas Cornelis van Keijck, born in the Netherlands. He had stowed away to the United States as a young man, leaving behind a murky past that included a suspected connection to a violent crime in his homeland. A murder that may have driven him to flee for good. He never became a U.S. citizen. He rarely spoke of his past. He wore straw hats and bow ties, called himself Colonel, and wrapped his entire identity in a kind of southern fried mystery. He was, in essence, a con man, but a brilliant one. Before Elvis, Parker had managed country acts like Eddie Arnold and Hank Snow. He was shrewd, manipulative, and unapologetically focused on money. Not art. Not legacy. Not culture. Just dollars. So when he saw Elvis, this wild, awkward, magnetic boy from Memphis with a black man's voice and a white man's body, he didn't just see talent. He saw gold. Parker moved in quickly. In 1955, after witnessing Elvis perform and watching the audience erupt, He began maneuvering to take full control of the young singer's career. He ousted Elvis's then manager Bob Neal. He pushed Hank Snow, who'd helped introduce Elvis to RCA, out of the way. And by the time the ink dried, Colonel Tom Parker held Elvis's future in his palm. Now, here's what you have to understand about Parker. He was not a music man. He was a carnival barker, through and through. He didn't care what the product was, as long as it could sell. And to him, Elvis wasn't just a singer. He was a commodity. Parker once said, without a hint of irony, "I don't think you can overexpose Elvis Presley." And he lived by that motto. He negotiated Elvis's legendary deal with RCA Records, selling his contract for $35,000, an unheard of sum at the time. He secured merchandise rights, from buttons and posters to lipstick and bubblegum, and took a staggering 50% cut of every dollar Elvis earned. Most managers took 10 to 15%. Parker? He took half. And Elvis let him. Because Elvis trusted him. You see, the boy from Tupelo wasn't a businessman. He was soft-hearted, loyal to a fault. And Parker played the role perfectly, part manager, part father figure, part ringmaster. He convinced Elvis that everything he did was for his good. And for a time, it worked. It was Parker who orchestrated the TV appearances that catapulted Elvis to national stardom, including the now iconic Ed Sullivan Show, where the camera famously cut away from Elvis's gyrating hips. It was Parker who arranged the movies, the tours, the press. He kept Elvis visible, kept him everywhere. But visibility came at a cost. Because Parker wasn't interested in protecting Elvis's soul, only his image. He wanted him clean enough for the parents, dangerous enough for the kids, and profitable enough for himself. As Elvis became a sensation, Parker made sure the machine never stopped running. And the boy who once sang alone under a tree now belonged to the world. But the cracks would show. Parker refused to let Elvis tour internationally, ever. Why? Because Parker, as an undocumented immigrant, couldn't leave the country without risking exposure. And rather than admit that, he clipped Elvis's wings. There were opportunities, legendary ones. The Beatles toured globally, Sinatra toured globally. But Elvis never left North America. He never performed in Europe. Never set foot in Asia. Because his manager was afraid of a passport. Parker also pushed Elvis into an endless stream of films, over 30 by the end of the 1960s, many of them cheap, formulaic musicals. They made money, yes, but they drained Elvis, stripped him of artistic growth, and left him longing for something real. There was a moment, later in life, when Elvis is said to have looked around the Hollywood lot, sighed, and said, "I'm so tired of playing Elvis Presley." And that tells you everything. He had become a product, a character in his own story, all guided by a man who never truly loved him, only the cash he brought in. Colonel Tom Parker built the empire. No one can deny that. But he also built the gilded cage that Elvis would never fully escape. And while Parker counted profits, Elvis began counting pills, counting nights of loneliness, counting the weight of a life that felt less and less like his own. But that part comes later. For now, picture it. A carnival man with secrets in his pocket. A southern boy with music in his blood. And a deal, signed in ink, sealed in trust, that would shape the rest of American pop culture. Elvis had the voice. He had the soul. But Parker? Parker had the control. Fame is a strange thing. At first, it feels like freedom. The world opens up, the lights shine brighter, people lean in when you speak. But if you're not careful, it becomes a costume, a cage, a name you no longer recognize. And that's what happened to Elvis. Because at some point in the late 1950s, between the TV appearances, the screaming fans, the movie deals and the merchandising contracts, Elvis Presley stopped being just a person and became a product. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was slow, calculated, and deeply profitable. Colonel Tom Parker, ever the showman, understood something that Elvis never quite grasped. Fame isn't just about the music. It's about the myth. So he began to craft one. Gone was the shy boy from Tupelo with trembling hands and gospel roots. In his place stood Elvis Presley, slicked back, polished, larger than life. A brand. A logo. A commercial empire wrapped in flesh and rhinestones. Everything was up for sale. There were Elvis lunchboxes, Elvis lipstick, Elvis pajamas. You could buy his signature sunglasses, his cologne, his records, his life-size cardboard cutout. Parker even authorized the sale of "I Hate Elvis" buttons, just to make sure he got both sides of the market. And the more Parker fed the machine, the more it demanded. Elvis didn't just sing anymore. He performed. Constantly. He acted in movies, not because he loved the scripts, but because the studios paid well and the films guaranteed tie-in soundtracks. Each year blurred into the next, another film, another record, another press tour. And through it all, Elvis was expected to be one thing. Elvis. Not a man. Not a thinker. Not someone who changed, aged, or questioned the world around him. Just the icon. The brand. The king. But the thing about being a brand is, you're no longer allowed to be human. When Elvis got tired, people said he was lazy. When he gained weight, they said he was losing it. When he wanted privacy, they called him ungrateful. When he pushed back, even gently, Parker reminded him of the contract. The image must stay intact. And so, he played the part. He posed. He smiled. He signed. He shook hands and kissed babies and kept the dream alive. But inside, he was growing more isolated, more trapped. Because the more famous he became, the less control he had over his own life. You see, Elvis wasn't a mogul. He wasn't a businessman. He didn't read contracts. He didn't negotiate terms. He didn't even know how to say no. He trusted Parker. He trusted the system. And that trust cost him everything. Imagine being the most recognizable face on earth. And still feeling like a puppet. That's what Elvis was becoming. Even his look was no longer his own. The pompadour, the sideburns, the jumpsuits, all carefully curated. His fashion, his speech, his mannerisms, all commodified. He once joked, "I'm just an image. A thing." But there was pain in that joke. Because inside, Elvis was still that boy, the one who sang in church with his mama, who listened to black gospel choirs from outside the tents, who hummed to himself in the dark when no one else was listening. But no one wanted that boy anymore. They wanted Elvis. The glittering, gyrating, glossy figure who made them scream. And so, he gave them what they wanted. Even when it hurt. Even when it emptied him. He kept performing. Kept posing. Kept signing. Even as the man inside the myth began to slip away. And I can't help but wonder sometimes if he ever looked in the mirror, past the sequins, past the sunglasses, and asked himself, "Where did I go?" Because somewhere in the machinery of celebrity, in the $1 million smile, and the gold records and the endless tours, the real Elvis, the soul, the voice, the human being, got lost. And what we were left with was the brand. Elvis Presley. A product polished to perfection. Until, of course, it all began to crack. But that part comes later. For now, just picture him there, surrounded by merchandise with his own face on it. His music playing in the background, crowds chanting his name, and not a single person asking him, "How do you feel?" There is a paradox at the heart of every great celebrity. A tension between the person the world adores and the one who lives behind the scenes, often unseen, often unheard. Elvis Presley was no exception. On stage, he was a heartthrob, the living embodiment of desire, danger, and charm. Teenage girls screamed his name. Parents gasped at his moves. The media chased every step. He had that rare quality, the ability to make a stadium full of strangers feel like they were the only person in the room. His voice was raw and tender. His smile, a disarming curve of innocence and mischief. His hips, well, his hips caused a revolution all on their own. But off stage, he was something very different. A puppet, tied to the strings pulled by his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. Confined by the demands of a public that refused to see him as anything other than the king. Trapped inside a persona that demanded perfection and punished deviation. Elvis was not just performing music. He was performing himself. Or rather, the version of himself that others wanted to see. Every appearance was choreographed. Every interview rehearsed. Every outfit selected to maintain the illusion. And while the crowds roared behind closed doors, Elvis wrestled with the weight of expectations that felt heavier than any spotlight. He wanted to be more than a sex symbol, more than a movie star, more than a gold record. He wanted to be free. But freedom was elusive. The machinery that created Elvis Presley also controlled him. His touring schedule was grueling, designed not for rest, but for maximum profit. His film roles were often shallow, designed to keep him visible rather than fulfilled. His personal relationships were scrutinized, managed, and often strained. And as the years passed, the strain showed. The playful, rebellious boy became increasingly withdrawn. The spark in his eyes flickered under the pressure. Substance abuse crept in. A way to numb the loneliness, the pain, the exhaustion. Yet the world kept cheering. Because the public only saw the heartthrob. They didn't see the man tangled in the strings. They didn't hear the silent cries behind the roar. Elvis was the ultimate contradiction. A man who gave so much of himself to millions, yet was denied the simplest gift, autonomy. And that tension, that dance between adoration and control, shaped the tragic arc of his life. It's a reminder that behind every icon is a human being. Behind every legend, a story of struggle. And behind every dazzling smile, sometimes, a quiet plea for release. Imagine, if you will, a gilded cage. Not one made of iron bars, cold and harsh, but one constructed from flashing cameras, endless contracts, and the ever-watchful gaze of millions. This was Elvis Presley's prison. A place where freedom was an illusion, and every move was dictated by unseen forces. By the mid-1950s, Elvis had become not just a singer, but a brand, carefully packaged, marketed, and controlled. Behind the scenes, a complex machinery hummed tirelessly to maintain the image the world craved. At the center of this machine was Colonel Tom Parker, the man who managed Elvis's career with the precision of a puppet master. Contracts bound Elvis like chains. Long-term deals with record labels, film studios, and merchandise companies gave Parker extraordinary power over his earnings and choices. Parker's cut was enormous, often taking up to half of Elvis's income. Elvis wasn't just the artist. He was a walking, singing asset, one whose value Parker guarded jealously. Tours were scheduled relentlessly. Rest was a luxury Elvis couldn't afford. Movie roles were chosen not for artistic merit, but for profitability. His image was carefully sculpted: the slicked back hair, the rhinestone jumpsuits, the perfectly rehearsed moves. Every public appearance was choreographed. The press was fed stories that kept Elvis enigmatic yet accessible. And yet, despite this dazzling public persona, Elvis was increasingly trapped. He could not easily say no to Parker. He could not escape the relentless demands. He was tethered by contracts that prioritized profits over personal well-being. And as his fame soared, so too did the pressure. The king became a prisoner of the very machinery that created him. Inside this prison, Elvis wrestled not just with the demands of stardom, but with his own identity. He longed to break free, to be a man, not a product. But the walls closed in tighter with every record sold, and every film released. The Hollywood prison cell was invisible to the adoring fans. But to Elvis, it was all too real. And the cost? His health. His happiness. Ultimately, his very life. There is a cruel irony in the life of Elvis Presley. The very empire built to crown him king slowly became the bars of his cage. And inside that cage he found solace, an escape, in substances that promised relief, but delivered only chains. Elvis's story is not unique in this sense. Many stars have fallen prey to the demands of fame, the relentless schedule, the suffocating scrutiny, the loneliness amid crowds. But for Elvis, it was especially tragic, because the golden cage was so bright, so blinding, no one saw the man behind it struggling to breathe. As his career skyrocketed through the 1960s and into the 70s, the pressures only mounted. Tours were exhausting marathons. Movie contracts drained his creative spirit. His personal life was under constant surveillance. To keep performing, to keep smiling, Elvis turned to a cocktail of prescription drugs. From stimulants to keep him awake and energized on stage, to sedatives and painkillers to numb the crushing exhaustion and physical ailments, the pills became his constant companions. His physicians, some complicit, others perhaps overwhelmed, prescribed everything from amphetamines and barbiturates to opiates. The lines between treatment and dependency blurred. Behind the glittering facade, Elvis was a man in pain, physical, emotional, and spiritual. Reports from those close to him speak of days when he could barely get out of bed. Nights spent wrestling with insomnia, anxiety, and despair. The drugs that once gave him energy and relief became a relentless trap. His health deteriorated. His weight fluctuated wildly. His behavior grew erratic. Yet the show had to go on. Fans expected the king to dazzle, to sing, to dance, to be larger than life. And Elvis, trapped in his gilded cage, tried to deliver, even as the golden throne beneath him crumbled. His dependency isolated him further. Those around him watched helplessly as the man they loved faded into shadows. Some tried to intervene, but the machine Parker ran was ruthless. Canceling shows meant lost revenue, lost image. And so the pills kept coming. The golden cage, it seemed, was also a prison of pain and addiction. As his body and mind weakened, so did his grip on the legacy he built. It was a slow unraveling, a tragedy not of sudden falls, but of gradual decay. The world would remember the king's voice, his smile, his swagger. But beneath it all was a man caught in the cruelest paradox of stardom. The more he gave to the world, the less he had left for himself. And that is the true heartbreak of Elvis Presley. To truly understand Elvis Presley, one must understand the man who shaped almost every aspect of his life and career, Colonel Tom Parker. Parker was no ordinary manager. He was a force of nature, part salesman, part strategist, part gatekeeper, with an uncanny ability to spin opportunity into empire. but also a man whose control over Elvis was absolute, sometimes suffocating. The relationship began in 1955, when Parker spotted the raw talent and charisma of a young Elvis Presley in a small recording studio in Memphis. From that moment, Parker's mission was clear: to build a superstar, a cultural phenomenon, and reap the rewards. But Parker's vision for Elvis was more than just about music. He saw the boy from Tupelo as a product to be marketed relentlessly. And market him he did. Under Parker's watchful eye, Elvis was pushed into every possible avenue: records, movies, merchandise, television specials, each carefully calculated to maximize profit. But this success came with strings that Parker pulled tightly. Parker controlled Elvis's finances, his contracts, his schedule, even his personal life. He was the gatekeeper between Elvis and the world. And Elvis, despite his fame and fortune, was often powerless to resist. Why? Because Parker was a master manipulator. He had a knack for convincing Elvis that every decision, no matter how draining or detrimental, was in his best interest. That every role, every tour, every publicity stunt was necessary. But Parker's decisions were often driven by his own financial gain. In fact, Parker notoriously took up to 50% of Elvis's earnings, an astronomical cut, unheard of for artists at the time. Yet, Elvis trusted him. He saw Parker as a mentor, a father figure, a protector. This trust, however, became a double-edged sword. It kept Elvis tied to exhausting tours and mediocre films that drained his spirit. It kept him locked into contracts that gave him little control over his own image and career choices. It limited his opportunities to grow as an artist and a man. Moreover, Parker's refusal to allow Elvis to tour internationally, supposedly due to his own undocumented immigrant status, restricted Elvis's global reach. This decision would haunt Elvis's legacy, limiting the King's true worldwide impact. Over time, the dynamic between the two grew strained. Elvis grew frustrated, yearning for freedom and autonomy. But Parker's grip only tightened. And when Elvis attempted to assert himself, to seek different management or creative control, Parker fought back fiercely. The power imbalance was clear. Elvis, despite his superstar status, was ensnared. And this control extended beyond business. Parker was known to manipulate Elvis's personal relationships, manage his interactions with the press, and shape public perception. In many ways, Parker controlled not just Elvis's career, but his very identity. It's a sobering reminder that behind the glittering facade of fame, there often lurks a puppeteer pulling the strings. Elvis Presley was the king on stage. But off stage, he was a man under the colonel's thumb. A king in chains. Graceland. Mention the name, and most will picture the sprawling estate, the grand white mansion perched atop a hill in Memphis, Tennessee. A palace befitting the king of rock and roll. But behind the manicured lawns and golden gates lay a story far less glamorous. A story of isolation, pressure, and the heavy price of fame. Elvis purchased Graceland in 1957, at the young age of 22, a symbol of success and a sanctuary from the relentless spotlight. To many, it was a dream come true, a place to call his own, a retreat where he could escape the frenzy of touring and filming. But the mansion soon became something else entirely. Graceland was more than a home, it was a fortress. High walls, electric fences, security guards, all designed to keep the world out. Because the world was hungry. Hungry for a glimpse of Elvis, hungry for a story, hungry for the king. Inside those walls, Elvis battled loneliness. The constant surveillance, the endless visitors, the weight of expectations. All made privacy a luxury he rarely enjoyed. Friends and family recall a man increasingly withdrawn, seeking comfort in the familiar rooms of his estate. Yet even those rooms began to feel like a cage, and the upkeep of Graceland was staggering. Maintenance, staff salaries, taxes, the financial burden weighed heavily on Elvis. It was a costly refuge, draining resources even as it provided shelter. More than the money, though, was the emotional toll. The mansion became a symbol of the paradox of fame. Success bringing isolation, wealth bringing insecurity. Elvis surrounded himself with trinkets, memorabilia, reminders of a simpler past, as if trying to hold on to a boy who had long since been swallowed by the king. Graceland was where he sought solace, but it was also where the shadows lengthened. In those vast rooms, the king's vulnerabilities grew, the aches of his body, the weight of his dependencies, the fractures in his spirit. Graceland was a gilded cage, beautiful but confining. And in the end, the cost of that sanctuary was not just financial. It was the cost of a man's peace. When we speak of Elvis Presley, the image that often comes to mind is that of a revolutionary figure, a young man from the South who changed the face of music forever. And while that is true, the full story is far more complicated. Because Elvis did not create rock and roll in a vacuum. Long before he stepped on stage, there were black artists shaping the sound, the spirit, the soul of the music he would soon popularize. Artists like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, B.B. King, and Sister Rosetta Tharpe, pioneers whose rhythms, lyrics, and raw emotion laid the foundation. Their music was a direct inheritance from the gospel, blues, and rhythm and blues traditions rooted deeply in African American communities. Yet, as Elvis rose to unprecedented fame, many of these trailblazers remained on the margins, overshadowed, underpaid, and underrecognized. Elvis had a voice and image that crossed racial lines during a segregated America. Something that major record companies saw as a market goldmine. His white skin allowed him to be embraced by mainstream audiences who were often resistant to black musicians. The record labels and media capitalized on this, marketing Elvis as the king of rock and roll, a title that sidelined many of the true originators. Elvis himself was influenced by these artists, openly acknowledging his admiration. But the system was structured to elevate him above them. This disparity sparked a complicated legacy. On one hand, Elvis brought rock and roll to a global stage, helping to break down racial barriers in popular music. On the other hand, the erasure and sidelining of black artists raised profound questions about cultural appropriation, inequality, and recognition. It's important to remember that behind the glitz and glamour was an industry deeply entangled in racism and commerce. For many black artists, the benefits of rock and roll's explosion were limited. They faced exploitation, discrimination, and exclusion from the financial rewards their music deserved. As we look back, we must recognize both the brilliance of Elvis and the debts owed to those who came before. The king's crown, shining so bright, rested on a foundation that was far less visible to the public eye. This duality, the celebration and the overshadowing, remains one of the most complex facets of Elvis Presley's story. And it's a reminder of the many voices, often unheard, that shape history. Imagine the bright, relentless lights of the Las Vegas Strip, neon signs flickering in the desert night, crowds pouring into glittering casinos, and the air thick with anticipation. It was here, under these very lights, that Elvis Presley took on a new chapter of his career, one that many would come to associate with both his triumph and his tragic decline. In 1969, after years away from live performances, Elvis returned to the stage in Las Vegas with a residency at the International Hotel, a bold move that shocked some and thrilled many. The comeback was nothing short of spectacular. He dazzled with his voice, his charisma, and those unmistakable hip shakes. For the first time in years, Elvis was back, commanding the stage like a king reclaiming his throne. But behind the smoke and mirrors, the reality was far more complicated. The Vegas shows were grueling. Night after night, Elvis performed multiple sets to packed audiences, often enduring physical pain and emotional exhaustion. The schedule left little room for rest or recovery. Moreover, the performances demanded a certain consistency, a delivery that satisfied thousands waiting for the show of a lifetime. But Elvis was changing. The pressures of constant touring, combined with his growing reliance on prescription medications, began to take their toll. His once powerful voice grew strained at times. His energy waned. Yet the show went on. The Vegas stage became both a refuge and a prison, a place where Elvis could still shine, even as the lights masked his struggles. The glamour of Las Vegas, the endless applause, the adoring fans, was a mirage. It concealed the fatigue beneath the rhinestones, the loneliness behind the curtain, the man behind the persona. In many ways, Vegas symbolized the duality of Elvis's later years. A dazzling spectacle on the surface, hiding the weariness beneath. And while audiences celebrated, the king wrestled with his fading health and dwindling freedom. The Vegas years were a testament to Elvis's resilience, and a poignant reminder of the cost of fame. There is a haunting sadness in watching a bright star slowly fade. Elvis Presley, once the epitome of youthful vigor and magnetic charm, became a man transformed by the weight of fame, addiction, and relentless pressure. In the prime of his career, Elvis commanded stages with boundless energy, his movements electrifying, his voice powerful, his presence magnetic. But as the years wore on, the man behind the sequins and swagger began to change. Physically, the transformation was undeniable. From his chiseled jawline and athletic frame, he gradually gained weight, his features softened, and his posture stooped. The youthful spark in his eyes dimmed beneath the heavy lids. Photographs from the 1970s reveal a man wrestling not just with his body, but with unseen demons. The relentless touring schedule, combined with years of prescription drug use, took a harsh toll. Medications meant to help him cope instead fueled dependency, clouding his mind and sapping his vitality. The once dynamic performer struggled with fatigue, mood swings, and erratic behavior. Emotionally, the transformation was even more profound. Behind closed doors, Elvis battled loneliness and despair. The isolation of fame, fractured relationships, and the pressures of maintaining a public facade wore heavily on his spirit. Friends and family would later describe a man caught between the adoration of millions and a deep personal sadness. His laughter, once infectious, sometimes gave way to silence. His smiles, at times, seemed forced. The physical changes mirrored the emotional ones, a poignant visual of a king losing his kingdom. Yet, despite the decline, Elvis continued to perform, driven by a mixture of obligation, passion, and perhaps fear. The stages he once conquered became places of struggle. His voice cracked where it once soared. His movements slowed, but the show went on. This sad transformation is not simply a story of decline. It's a reminder of the human cost of celebrity, of how the brightest lights can cast the darkest shadows, and of a man who, beneath it all, still longed to be free. Elvis Presley's life was a story told and retold through his music, his performances, and his iconic status as the king of rock and roll. But beneath the glitz and the glamour, there was a deeply personal and often painful story about the women in his life, the loves, the heartbreaks, and the guilt that followed. His relationships were as complex and intense as the man himself. Most famously, there was Priscilla Bullia, the woman who captured his heart during his years stationed in Germany as a young soldier. Their relationship was unlike many others. It was a whirlwind that culminated in marriage in 1967, when Elvis was just 32 and Priscilla only 21. Their union was, to the public, a fairy tale, the king and his queen. But behind the scenes, it was anything but simple. Elvis's life was dominated by his career, his touring, and the relentless demands of fame. His time at home was limited, and even then, shadows loomed. Priscilla has spoken openly about the challenges they faced. Elvis's frequent absences, the temptations of Hollywood, and the pressures that strained their bond. Their marriage lasted 6 years before ending in divorce in 1973. The dissolution was public, painful, and emblematic of a man struggling to balance love and duty. But the story of Elvis and the women in his life extends beyond Priscilla. Throughout his career, Elvis was surrounded by a parade of admirers, friends, and companions. Yet, many have described him as a man who longed for genuine connection but was often trapped by his fame and image. The expectations of being the king created a barrier between Elvis and intimacy. He struggled with feelings of isolation even in the company of others. This sense of loneliness fed into a deep-seated guilt over his marriage's failure, guilt over his inability to fully connect, and guilt over the personal choices he made. Friends and confidants recall moments when Elvis expressed remorse and sadness, moments rarely seen by the public. His relationship with his daughter, Lisa Marie, was a source of joy but also of complicated emotions. He was a devoted father, but his health and lifestyle limited his ability to be the parent he wished to be. The guilt weighed heavily, feeding into his dependence on medication and contributing to his emotional decline. In many ways, Elvis's story is a poignant reminder that behind the myth of the king was a man deeply human, vulnerable, conflicted, and searching for peace. The women in his life were not just companions or muses. They were mirrors reflecting the complexity of his soul. And in the end, their stories are inseparable from his own. Elvis Presley's story is often told in grand gestures, the electrifying performances, the adoring crowds, the groundbreaking records. But there is a quieter, more insidious chapter, one marked not by applause, but by pain and reliance. It began with a prescription. Like many performers of his era, Elvis faced the relentless demands of touring, performing, and living under the unforgiving spotlight. Chronic pain from injuries sustained during energetic shows, the pressures of constant travel, and the emotional toll of fame made relief a necessity. Doctors prescribed medications, initially to manage pain, help with sleep, or calm anxiety. At first, these pills were a lifeline. They allowed Elvis to keep going, to maintain the image of the vibrant, unstoppable king. But over time, the prescriptions multiplied. Sedatives, stimulants, painkillers, a cocktail of drugs that blurred the lines between help and harm. Dependency crept in quietly. Each pill offered temporary relief, but also deeper need. Behind closed doors, Elvis struggled with the cycle of medication, the craving for escape, the fear of withdrawal, the fog that clouded his mind. Those closest to him spoke of changes, mood swings, memory lapses, and erratic behavior. The man who once dazzled audiences with boundless energy now grappled with exhaustion and confusion. And the industry around him, aware of his condition, often turned a blind eye. There was money to be made, shows to be performed, and the king to be kept on stage. The medications became both a tool and a trap. By the mid-1970s, Elvis was heavily reliant on prescription drugs, a dependency that contributed to his declining health and ultimately, his premature death in 1977. His story is a cautionary tale, a reminder of how fame and pressure can lead even the brightest stars into darkness. and of how the very remedies meant to heal can sometimes become chains that bind. When discussing Elvis Presley's meteoric rise to fame, one cannot overlook the towering figure who guided much of his career, Colonel Tom Parker. To many, he was the shrewd manager, the master strategist, the man who turned a young singer from Tupelo into an international icon. But beneath the polished public persona lay a past wrapped in shadows, secrets that few knew, and fewer still dared to speak about. Colonel Parker was not a military colonel by birth, nor by official rank. His real name was Andreas Cornelis van Kijck, a Dutch immigrant whose beginnings were far from glamorous. He arrived in the United States under questionable circumstances, reportedly overstaying his visa and living with a fragile legal status. This secret weighed heavily on Parker throughout his life. It shaped his decisions and, ultimately, his control over Elvis. Parker's undocumented status meant he was limited in his mobility and choices. He couldn't travel freely outside the U.S., a fact that would later restrict Elvis's own international career. Many believe Parker deliberately kept Elvis from performing overseas, fearful that a foreign tour could complicate his own precarious situation. His grip on Elvis's career was absolute. Contracts, appearances, record deals, film roles, everything went through Parker's hands. Behind this control was a man who was both fiercely protective and deeply manipulative. Parker cultivated an image of loyalty and mentorship, but beneath that was a drive for profit and power. He demanded large percentages of Elvis's earnings, reportedly as much as 50%, a figure unheard of in the industry. Yet Elvis, young and trusting, went along. The secrecy surrounding Parker's past created an atmosphere of control cloaked in mystery. Few dared to question the colonel openly. His past was a secret he guarded zealously, a past that, had it been revealed fully in Elvis's lifetime, might have altered the course of history. This hidden history fueled rumors, mistrust, and eventually resentment. Many insiders believe that Parker's secret past directly contributed to some of the decisions that curtailed Elvis's artistic freedom. The very man who propelled Elvis to stardom may also have been a factor in the king's personal and professional constraints. Understanding Colonel Parker's secret past is essential to grasping the full story of Elvis Presley, not just as an artist, but as a man bound by forces seen and unseen. When you think of Elvis Presley, what comes to mind? Is it the dazzling performer, gyrating on stage to screaming fans? The cultural icon who broke boundaries and shaped an era? Or the private man, grappling with demons behind closed doors? The truth is, Elvis was all these things, and more. He was a contradiction wrapped in rhinestones. A southern boy who revered gospel and country, yet became the king of a rebellious new sound. A man who adored his mother deeply but struggled with his own emotional needs. An icon of freedom who was tightly controlled by those around him. A symbol of sexual liberation who was, in many ways, conservative and shy. His contradictions were woven into every aspect of his life. Elvis's public image was crafted carefully, the white-hot star, a beacon of youthful energy and charm. But privately, he was often uncertain, vulnerable, and searching. He loved luxury but found solace in simple pleasures. A peanut butter and banana sandwich, a walk in the countryside, quiet moments away from the chaos. He embraced change on stage but clung to traditions at home. In music, he blurred genres, borrowing from black rhythm and blues, country twang, and gospel soul, yet the world boxed him into the king of rock and roll. His style was flashy, yet his personality was often humble, sometimes awkward. He could be generous to a fault, yet prone to isolation. Even his fame was double-edged. It gave him unprecedented power and adoration, but also intense scrutiny and pressure. He was loved by millions but often felt profoundly alone. This contradiction extended to his health. A performer known for electrifying energy became burdened by physical pain and addiction. A man who brought joy to others struggled privately with depression and insecurity. Elvis's life was a tapestry of opposites: success and sorrow, light and shadow, freedom and constraint. To understand Elvis is to embrace this paradox. He was not a flawless legend but a deeply human figure, flawed, complex, and endlessly fascinating. And it is this very contradiction that makes his story timeless. The morning of August 16, 1977, dawned hot and heavy over Memphis, Tennessee. Outside Graceland's gates, the world carried on, unaware that it was about to lose one of its most luminous stars. Inside the mansion, Elvis Presley lay silent, a man both larger than life and painfully fragile. He had been found unresponsive in his bathroom by his fiancée, Ginger Alden. The news spread like wildfire, shocking fans across the globe. The king was dead. But the story of Elvis's final day is a complex and somber tale, one that reveals much about the man behind the myth. Despite his fame and fortune, Elvis's health had been declining for years. The effects of prescription drug use, relentless touring, and personal struggles had taken a devastating toll. On that day, he suffered a fatal heart attack, a culmination of years of physical and emotional strain. Yet, in his final moments, Elvis was alone. Not in the grand public spaces where crowds cheered, but in the quiet confines of his private world. This solitude echoes a tragic irony. A man who captivated millions, who filled stadiums and hearts, died surrounded by emptiness. Friends and family rushed to Graceland, grief-stricken and stunned. The world mourned a king who had seemed invincible. His funeral was a gathering of sorrow and celebration, thousands paying respects to a legend. But behind the public mourning lay a deeper reflection. The king had lived a life marked by brilliance and contradiction, a man who gave so much to the world, yet often felt isolated within it. His death alone serves as a poignant reminder of the cost of fame, of the loneliness that can accompany even the brightest lights, and of the human behind the icon, vulnerable, flawed, and mortal. Elvis Presley's passing was the end of an era. But his music, his influence, and his story continued to resonate, reminding us that even legends are, in the end, profoundly human. When Elvis Presley died in 1977, the world mourned the loss of a cultural icon, a revolutionary artist, and a larger-than-life figure who had forever changed the landscape of music and popular culture. But as the lights dimmed on the king's life, the show, as they say, had to go on. Behind the scenes, an industry primed to capitalize on Elvis's fame swiftly took control. Graceland became a shrine, a pilgrimage site for millions. Records were reissued, unreleased tracks were mined, and merchandise flooded the market. The Elvis machine churned relentlessly. For some, this was a tribute, a way to keep the king's spirit alive. For others, it was a cold business calculated to squeeze every last dollar from his legacy. The machine that once propelled Elvis to stardom now worked tirelessly to preserve and profit from his name. Estate managers, record labels, marketers, all played roles in shaping the posthumous image of Elvis. The man who had once sought freedom found his persona curated and commodified. Some family members voiced concerns about the commercialization. Others saw it as a necessary way to sustain the estate and preserve the music. Fans, meanwhile, had mixed feelings. Some embraced the ongoing celebration of Elvis. Others mourned the dilution of his authentic voice amid endless repackaging. But the machine moves on, regardless. Elvis's likeness appeared on everything from t-shirts to slot machines. Documentaries and films retold his story, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with sensationalism. The king's name became a brand, a symbol both powerful and paradoxical. And as decades passed, new generations discovered Elvis through this carefully maintained legacy. His music continues to influence artists worldwide. His image remains instantly recognizable. Yet, beneath the fanfare, there is an undeniable tension between honoring a man who changed music forever and the reality of a legacy shaped as much by commerce as by art. The machine moves on. And with it, the story of Elvis Presley endures, sometimes shining bright, sometimes shadowed by the hands that control it. When we think of Elvis Presley, we often see the king, the swaggering performer, the cultural icon, the man who changed music forever. But beneath that glittering surface, there was a man who rarely got the chance to just be himself. From a young age, Elvis was molded, shaped, and often controlled by forces far larger than he was. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, was a master at crafting an image, one that the public could adore but that left little room for personal freedom. Elvis was expected to be the perfect entertainer, the flawless star, the symbol of a new era. This meant conforming to an image that sometimes felt alien to the real man inside. He was a sensitive soul, deeply connected to his roots, his family, and his music. Yet, the demands of superstardom meant that every move was scrutinized, every choice weighed against what the public expected. Elvis wanted to explore his artistry, to push boundaries, and to live authentically. But the pressures to maintain his brand, the jumpsuits, the choreography, the carefully managed public persona, often felt like chains. He was, in many ways, a prisoner of his own fame. The man who sang gospel, blues, and country was packaged as the king of rock and roll, a title that brought adoration but also confinement. Behind closed doors, Elvis wrestled with this duality. He sought solace in quiet moments, in family gatherings, and in simple pleasures away from the spotlight. Yet, the tension between who he was and who he was expected to be never fully eased. This struggle took a toll on his mental health, his relationships, and ultimately on his sense of self. Many close to him observed a man who felt misunderstood, sometimes lost beneath the glittering crown. He was a man yearning to be free, yet bound by the very fame that made him immortal. Elvis Presley, the man, never fully got to be himself. And it is this tragic truth that deepens the legend. A reminder that behind every icon is a human story of longing, sacrifice, and complexity. And so, as our journey through the life of Elvis Presley comes to a close, we find ourselves standing quietly at the edge of a story far greater than any one man. A story of dreams and contradictions, of brilliance and vulnerability, of a king who carried both light and shadow within him. Elvis's legacy is not just in the music or the legend, it lives in the spaces between, in the truths we often overlook, and in the gentle reminder that behind every crown lies a human heart, beating with hopes, fears, and the desire to be understood. As you lay your head down tonight, perhaps you carry with you a piece of his story, a whisper of resilience, a lesson in complexity, or simply the comfort of knowing that even those who shine brightest walk paths filled with shadows. Thank you for sharing this quiet moment with me. Wherever you are, and whatever hour it is, may your night be peaceful, your dreams gentle, and your heart a little lighter. Until next time, rest well, and let the stories of the night guide you softly into sleep. Good night.